Well, good afternoon for all in the UK and good morning for in Brazil. Welcome to the second day of our seminar in critical pedagogies in STEM education. For those who are not here yesterday, my name is Arthur Galamba. I'm the director of the STEM Education Hub at King's Brazil Institute, and I'm chairing this seminar. I want to remind everyone, this is a bilingual seminar with simultaneous translation, and you need to select the channel with the language that you like to have translated to you. And I will give this message in Portuguese too. So, lembrando a todos que isso aqui é um seminário bilíngue e que nós temos traduções simultâneas e que você deve selecionar o canal que você quer escutar as apresentações, tá? So, the STEM Education Hub was co-created only 8 months ago by King's College London and British Council Brazil. It aims at building opportunities for collaboration between Brazil and the UK in all areas of STEM education, and with special attention to gender and race inclusion, democracy, and citizenship. We are very proud of our achievements in our first year, and I urge you to visit our website to find out more about our past and future events, and also about our amazing partners in the 2 countries. I can share with you right now the link for our website in the chat, in case you want to click on it and find out more about what we've been doing and who we are. If you use Twitter, please support us and let people know about our seminar today, okay? You can tag us. You can see right here what our Twitter of our STEM Education Hub is, and please tag us and spread the word about the seminar that's happening today. Yesterday, we had 5 very thought-provoking presentations from Isabel Martins, from Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, Ana Benite from Universidade Federal de Goiás, Bruno Monteiro from Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, Samuel Urban from Universidade Estadual do Rio Grande do Norte, and Haida Gandolfi from University of Cambridge. I'd like to thank them again and say we have got many messages from teachers and researchers thanking you for the very engaging presentations and for addressing issues related to decolonization, gender and race in science and science education. So if you missed the seminar yesterday, we have collected material from presentations and we'll make them available on our website. So I ask you please to visit the website to find out more, and also go to Join Us tab so you can subscribe to our STEM Education Hub network and be informed about new material that's coming up, and don't miss anything that we've been doing in our hub. Now, for today's seminar, we have 5 more presenters sharing their research interest and explaining their perspectives on the challenges to implement critical pedagogy in STEM education. I'm really delighted that we have Ralph Levinson from the Institute of Education at UCL, who will report on a research that looks into how students' socioeconomic background might be correlated with their engagement with real research problems. We also have Betzabe Torres-Olave from University of Bristol, who will tell us about possible ways to unmake embedded neoliberal values using critical pedagogies and consider the roles for the youth in transforming the world towards social, epistemic, and environmental justice. And must add that together with her, we are having Gonzalo Guerrero, who is presenting alongside Betzabe. Then we're going to have a presentation from Lindsay Hetherington from University of Exeter, who will explore the implications of a material dialogic theory for science education for diversity, and what happens in learning through dialogue when we include material voices in the dialogue. Then we're going to move on to Christina Myers from Edtech Hub, who asks the question, what would engaging, empowering, and inclusive online education look like? She was inspired by critical pedagogies to enable learners to have agency over their learning, to use critical thinking as a tool to create social and political engagement. And last but not least, Spela Godec from also from the Institute of Education, UCL, will tell us about her research on science capital and how this approach can engage diverse students with science, especially from those from minority backgrounds who tend to be underrepresented in further science education and employment. So we have asked all presenters to talk for about 25 minutes, and then we will have 20 more minutes for questions after each presentation. For the panelists, as we did yesterday, please feel free to raise your hand at any time to ask questions. It's lovely when we have questions coming from you too. And for all the attendees, please use the chat to type in your questions. Then I will select a few questions and read them out to the presenters, okay? We are recording presentations today, and we'll make them available later on our website. Also, finally, I'm nearly done with this housekeeping. I'd like to announce that the British Council will publish an ebook by the end of the year on critical pedagogies and in STEM, and we have invited all presenters to collaborate. So please follow us on Twitter for updates, okay? So thank you very much. We are slightly ahead of time. We were expecting to have Ralph with us from 1:15, but I think it's good to start slightly early so that gives like more buffer time. Okay, so I'd like to invite Ralph for his presentation. Thank you very much, Ralph. We're looking forward to it.
Thank you, Arthur. First of all, thank you for asking me and the conversations we had before this. And also thank you to the British Council for what has been really an amazingly good conference meeting so far. And also, in particular, to the interpreters, I really can appreciate what a very difficult job it is. And I'd just like to start by saying I have learned Portuguese. And many years ago, when I have a lot of connections with Brazil, it's a country I work with most by far. And I was in Brazil, I think in 2006, and I was giving a seminar at the University in Santa Catarina, the Federal University. And I gave my seminar in Portuguese, having practiced it a lot. And 5 minutes into the seminar, the chair tugged my sleeve, who was sitting next to me, and he said, "Ralph, can I have your attention for one moment?" And I said, "Yeah, that's fine." And he said, "We really appreciate it that you are giving your presentation in Portuguese, but we understand your English much better than we understand your Portuguese. So I'm going to I'm afraid I'm not going to impose my Portuguese on you, except to say bom dia to everybody, or boa tarde if you're in London, bom dia if you're in Brazil. I'd just say how lovely it is, again, to be working with friends in Brazil. I know Isabel Martins very well, who's a close friend, and in fact, we're writing a book together. I've known Isabel for many years. And also, Heyra in particular used to be my doctoral student. And I'm delighted she's now in Cambridge. But of course, I know many people on the Brazil, from Brazil background. So it's great to be here. So I want to start. I will start sharing my screen, and now I'll just Right, so yeah. So I just, I've got the shared window is closed, but shall I try again? It's for some reason it's not sharing.
It's coming up now.
Is it coming up now? Right, okay.
I think it is.
So I discussed this with Arthur beforehand, what I was going to talk about.
Ralph, sorry, it's still a black screen for me.
Yes, I can see.
To know if it's the internet connection or maybe just Zoom.
While we're waiting, Arthur, shall I just say a little bit about it? So,
sure.
Okay. So what I want the topic I'm going to look at, hopefully when the PowerPoint comes up, is students from 17-year-old students, school students, talking about contemporary research. And what I want to present here, to make the point in the end, in fact, that much of the talk has been on Science Capital, and I know this will be discussed later. But I want to present at the end of this a rather controversial view, that in fact it's students who are particularly socially disadvantaged that might have the most to offer, and in fact might be best placed to discuss and to do research. The prevalent feeling is that science specialists and those who have a strong science background are most likely to do research, whereas I want to argue the opposite. I want to argue that in fact, not necessarily having a strong science background and having a life beyond school, the works beyond school, might be far more important in making one a researcher than actually doing lots of things in science at school. Now I see my slide still hasn't come up. Shall I stop share and start again, try again?
I think it's a good idea.
Okay.
Yeah, try again, otherwise I will share them for you.
Yeah, great. Okay, I'll try again. It's still, screen's still looking black. I can see, in fact, I can't see where my presentation has now got to. Yeah, I think if you can show them for me, I'm really sorry.
Okay, just a second.
I can't seem to get hold of them. Great, that's it. Good. Yeah, go from the start. Thanks. Can everybody see that? No? Yeah, okay. So what I want to look at, the topic I want to look at is how do school students engage with scientific research? And I'm talking here about 17-year-old students, 16, 17-year-old students. Can I have the next slide? And what I have chosen here is a picture of STEM. And if you Google STEM and STEM at school, this is the kind of picture you'll see. Children or young people looking very excited, and their focus is on a practical work. Their focus is on things, it's on apparatus. It's very exciting to see apparatus. In this case, it happens to be alternative energies, looking at a wind farm, thing. But the point is that what is here is excitement. And what I want to question an equipment, and I would argue that is very strongly a prevalent view of science in schools, that it's about stuff, it's about practical work. And what I want to argue is that actually discussion and communality is more crucial than the practical work, and that science has somehow become distinctive or STEM because because of the equipment. And what I want to argue is that maybe this isn't the case. So if we can go on to the next slide. Thank you. And if you look at STEM and do a quick Google search, you'll see these are the main things that come up: skills shortage and skills gap, national competitiveness, that somehow the more STEM we do, the better our STEM base, the more competitive we will be as a nation. Nothing about how we can work together with other countries or what this might comprise, but it's about how we can compete. Enterprise, which is predominantly a business term, is commercial term. How you can go out and sell your skills on the market. It's a marketization-based discourse. We have narrowing the attainment gap, as if to question, well, why should there be a gap in the first place? What does it mean to have an attainment gap? Brightest and best, and a term which I actually really despise is the term ability. That the brightest and the best are somehow, we've got to get the best people doing science. And we have quite an image of what that means by brightest and best. We also have the term social mobility, that somehow you can rise through class, through doing science, and enrichment, that we can do more to give you, to enrich the STEM. And I would raise the fact that STEM and the rise of neoliberalism are two things which are very strongly connected. One might ask, what has happened to the term science, and why now science is universally referred to as STEM. So if we can go on to the next slide. And I should say while waiting that I should have described myself at first. Probably those of you who can hear my voice will use, I'm a male, I'm a white male, and an old white male who is now semi-retired, but still doing some work in science education. And I want to first of all briefly present my theoretical perspective, which is to use critical realism, not use critical realism both in my methodology and in my way of thinking about the world. And for those of you, I don't spend much time talking about critical realism, but to state that the important part about critical realism is that it acknowledges that there are different ontological states which can explain how we think or can explain phenomena, and that these ontological states are emergent. So, for example, the reason I'm speaking to you today, because I belong, if you like, socioculturally to an academic group of relations between the UK and Brazil. And that's on one level, on an academic level. But on another level, I wouldn't be speaking to you if I didn't have enough to eat, if I was starved, if I was poverty-stricken. And that these are facts that, although that might not be apparent, what's important in critical realism is it looks at what is absent, what is not said about things. And what is not said is why, you know, the people here are broadly well fed and have a reasonable background. And the question is, well, why isn't that available to people? What is it that people who don't have enough to eat or drink or who have social problems cannot reach that stage? So critical realism aims to look both at what's crucial in science, but also what are the socio-political factors that underpin explanations. And that these ontological states emerge. So I want to argue, for example, a school is a good example. You have people and children and adults and a building, but that doesn't make a school. What makes a school are the interactions that go on between those various entities. So things emerge from particular states. Water is perhaps a good example, since we're on science. I would say, as you know, the formula of water broadly is H2O. Water, the hydrogen is made from hydrogen gas and oxygen, both of which are inflammable. But when you combine them, they make water. Water is emergent. Water is different. It's non-flammable and it's liquid. And what I want to say that as you go through these ontological states, they emerge into something quite different from what they were before. But all the states are influential in determining how we learn and how schools exist. Okay, so if I can go on to the next slide. Thank you. And what I want to look at is to give a little bit of background. About 4 years ago, a colleague of mine who is not an educationalist, but is a developmental biologist, Professor Stephen Price, was actually approached by an old student of mine who was a teacher, who wanted to ask him to talk about his research to his students in what was a socially disadvantaged school in London. And he came in and he talked about his research, and the students were interested. And he invited them back to UCL to look at his lab and to talk about research. And that's where I became involved. And we decided I'd just read this book, this monogram by Epstein, in which he stresses the importance of discussing his science research with first-year undergraduates, humanities undergraduates in the United States, and that this had enthused them. And it's a very old paper now, but the points he made are that students should be new to research, the focus should be on the researcher's work, students should be able to question, and there's no pressure to participate. And we decided to see what would happen if we use this idea, this approach with school students, 17-year-old school students who came into UCL. If we can have the next slide. And so we were approached, and we had a few schools involved, not just one school, a few schools. And our research questions were, does engagement in discussing a contemporary research problem with a scientist enable school students to exhibit salient features of research science? In other words, how far does discussing an issue help students to get involved in research? And our very particular view was to make it about discourse, about discussion, about a problem, about the problem this scientist was working on. We also wanted to find out how students use their knowledge to address the research problem and how they make new meanings and address gaps of understanding. And we also want to look at what discursive moves, what kind of moves help them to make this meaning. So if I can have the next slide. And we looked back in the literature, and there was a very useful study by Chinna Malhotra in 2002, which looked at the difference between school science and research science. And I would argue, as a contentious issue, that school science is not a great way to get students interested in research, and that there are huge differences. And here are some of the differences. There are many differences that they identified. But particularly, I want to look, if you look at number 5, because it's relevant here. A scientist in science and research often has to control multiple variables. But in school, we talk about a control group, identifying one variable and using that to find out what happens. Now that you can do in a closed system. But what we do is we work in open systems, and this is the basis of critical realism, that our world is full of different factors which identify what we do. So if we can go on to the next slide. And so here was the school. This is an initial study. We're now got funding to engage in a second tranche of this study. Incidentally, we're also working with a university in Brazil, the Federal University of Minas Gerais in Itajuba. But if people here are interested, we'd certainly like to work with you. And in this first group, we were working with 3 different schools, X, Y, and Z. And we had, and then we asked the students in groups of 6 to discuss this research problem together. And if we can go to the next slide. And the research question was this. I'll try and make it as simple as possible. What are the mechanisms responsible for the separation of post-mitotic cells in the neural cord of the developing chick embryo? In other words, you have cells of the same genetic configuration. How is it that every time an organism develops, these cells separate and differentiate in the same way? What is the mechanism behind this? How might you explain this problem? And this was what the researcher was working on. And he also asked them to suggest models and experiments to test the validity of their suggestions. So next slide. And this is broadly, I just very quickly shows you, he gave them some short visual aids to go on. I want to look particularly at A and B, or A. A is the cells, they're not green and red, but he's using that simply for representational purposes. But the cells divide. Why is it that a certain group of cells divide? What is the mechanism behind this? Okay, next slide. And we identified, as the students talked about this in episodes, 3 different discursive moves that helped them to talk about this problem. Scaffolding from the researcher, elaboration of a problem, and problematization. In other words, making that the problem is not as simple as it first sounds. Next slide, we can have that. So I just want to talk you through the scaffolding section. So here are students from a school in East London. It's from a socially disadvantaged area, a very large Muslim population, Afro-Caribbean students. In fact, none of the students were white. These were all black students here. And here is the researcher says, okay, you've got these cells. We've drawn them as orange and green. What might work in terms of attraction? And student X says, would you have to see, because it happens all over the body, so would you have to see any common factors that linking all the groupings together? So what she's doing is she's recognizing that this might happen in other parts of the body as well, this cell segregation. And the researcher says, so how would these work, do you think? And she suggests things like, might it be environmental pH levels or iron levels, or whatever's going on, you can link together on what could attract cells. So this was a scaffolding, this was the start of helping the students to get to grips with the problem. Next slide. Yeah. And then we have elaboration. And then student Y comes in, she's quiet, but after this, she says, well, it might be to do with the cell membranes. Like it depends what makes the orange cell different from the green cell. Okay, says a research scientist. So like, could it be to do with cell signaling? It happens with glycoproteins. So maybe then there are signs of glycoproteins in the cells which would help differentiate them. So she begins to identify something she's come across before and asks, is that the problem? The research scientist says, okay, so what's the model? You're saying that the orange cells are similar? Yes. And that the green cells are similar? How does that make them separate? And says, there might be another mechanism in the body that, like, for example, things might like attach to the glycoproteins, because I'm just linking back to things that we've done in the school with like antibodies and stuff. And he says, yeah, can have the next slide. Sorry, we'll follow on. So she's developing things in the cell membrane, and she says, well, maybe it's how antibodies and antigens work. So they're proteins. So if they're not found on the green cell, these antibodies, then the thing in the body won't be able to attach. So the green cell will be able to bring it over to a different area. So she's using the antigen antibody mechanism to start thinking about that. Okay, so if there was a mechanism that attached to one of the proteins on the membrane of the orange cell, but it wouldn't be able to attach to the green cell, then eventually over time, all of the orange cells would end up in one place being attached to those proteins. So she's developed a model. And he says, okay, very good. What do the rest of the group think about that model? Okay, so if I can go to the next slide, I'll push that. And then finally is the problematization. So they decide that they're going to look for proteins in the cell membrane. That's what they would do. And then Don, one of the boys, says, but what if we don't know what protein we're looking for? We don't know what base to look for. And then X says, who's the previous student, we could look for common practice. And if we loads of proteins on, then we could first see what's the same in both the cells, and then what's different, and continue in that way. And then Don says, and this is crucial, he said, what if we denature the proteins? So we heat up the cells, let the proteins denature, but the cells don't get destroyed. And then we see if they still split. So he's saying, let's do a control. Let's denature some of the proteins. And X says, but what would that? And then Z says, but would it be possible to denature the protein without affecting how the cell works? And Donny's fondly said, so can we do it? Now, the point is about what Z has said. Z has identified that one variable control is not possible. And yet that's something that's commonly done in schools. And that makes them realize the problems of thinking about research science. So if we can go to the next slide. So what were the findings of this? And I'll finish shortly. So first of all, by discussing this problem, they became aware of the differences between school science and research science, that research science is much messier and much more open. They've appreciated the importance of discussion and critique before practical work, because the students said, is this what scientists do? Do they talk about stuff? They had this image of scientists just doing stuff. Scientists were people who wear white coats and work at a bench. Now, what we found is that the students from the more socially disadvantaged schools generated more fruitful discussions. Now, we also did and published this research in Cyprus and found exactly the same trend. The more socially disadvantaged the school, the more diverse the school, the more fruitful the discussions. And there was also anecdotal evidence we have from talking to the students afterwards that they think about science and science research in ways that conflict with traditional notions of science capital and enrichment. In other words, actually social, because they had never come across a scientist, never done this before, it actually enhanced their interest and their enthusiasm in what they were doing. The other thing, and we got this back from teachers, is that those students who were studying a mix of science and humanities responded more fruitfully and critically. So the idea is you get students to do specialist science, but in fact we found that when students did a range of subjects, they have more to contribute towards the problem. And finally, I did mention students X, Y, and Z by name, or even my name, because all those three were young women who wore the hijab. So they were young Muslim women. And when we asked them, about how they discussed and how they argued afterwards, they said that where they learned to argue was in an Islamic Sunday school, in the madrasa. Now, madrasa means expound in Arabic. It means to discuss. But in the light of the press about terrorism and Islam, the madrasa was seen as a place of indoctrination. But in fact, students Y and Z, these young women reported that their study of dialectics in the madrasa was important in thinking about counterpositions. And indeed, they were the most vocal and most argumentative of the students. And we're suggesting, what I'm suggesting is actually that there may be things which we haven't considered, i.e. what's absent, what we haven't considered, that may play an important role in students' ability to discuss scientific research. And if I can go to the final slide. So what we want to suggest is that the pipeline economic model of science may not be the best one to help us understand what might make really enthusiastic researchers in science. We would also suggest downplaying the role of practical work, but upplaying the role of discussion to allow students to discuss what they think, to talk about themselves, to talk about their experiences and bring that to the table. And that can enable them to think critically about the hidden world. What are these things that help things to change? We also think it's important that out of school discussions, that actually things that the cultural capital of religion, I'm not religious, so I'm certainly not making a place here for religion, but that the madrasa, that the Islamic, that the culture of the students, the background might play a much more important part in how they think about science than is taken on board. And finally, are the most academic students necessarily those who should be pursuing research? Now, I don't know, how much time have I got, Arthur? If I've got 2 or 3 minutes?
Oh, yes, yeah, you've got.
Okay. I want to say by another study I was involved in with a colleague of mine, Ruth Wielden. And here, this was a paper published, I can send details of the paper, about 5 or 6 years ago. And what we did, Ruth was a chemist, and those of you who are chemists might know that when we talk about equilibrium states in chemistry, there's a very famous adage, the Le Chatelier equilibrium, which students use to think about the movement of equilibrium states. Now, the point is that this is used as an algorithm. And we went into a school and we asked lots and lots of students to think about what might happen to equilibrium states when they where they couldn't use Le Chatelier's principle. In other words, they really had to think about it constructively. And what we found was that the A-grade students and A-star students couldn't tackle the problem. They were good at using the algorithms, but they couldn't deal with the problem when they couldn't use the algorithm. The students who were actually B-grade students, there were 4 B-grade students who absolutely got into the problem and were most successful at solving it. And when we asked them, it was very clear that they saw the world as open. To them, the absurdity of a closed system world was one which is always taught in science, was one they couldn't quite contend with. And the teacher said, yes, these are bright students, these are clever, you know, they always have, but they always get low marks in exams. And we realized that the pushing for exams can actually disadvantage certain students. And certainly we have the work, if you know, those know the work of David Gilbourne in the UK, have shown that actually the system works, the education system works to disadvantage students from ethnic minorities and students who don't come from traditional middle class backgrounds. So what we want to question, so the question is to say that actually when thinking about research, the traditional school STEM views are ones that we would argue militate against diversity and militate against fruitful thinking about research, and that we really need to rethink this link between school science, diversity, STEM, and scientific research. And this is where I'll finish.